Hello, I'm Kent Chamberlain, Professor and Chair Emeritus in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of New Hampshire. I'm recording this video to provide details on a key recommendation of the New Hampshire Commission that I served on last year. That commission was convened to explore the health and environmental impacts of microwave radiation from wireless devices of any generation. That's what the G stands for, along with the industry's current push to densify 4G and 5G antennas in our community. I served on the commission along with other experts in the scientific community, and I've been active in public outreach since the commission submitted its final report in November 2020. I was selected to serve on the commission because of my background in electromagnetics, wireless communications, and radio frequency engineering. This video is one in a series of videos that I have created to document some of the findings of the New Hampshire Commission, and I've linked those videos in the comments below. And I've linked the slides for this video in the comment section so that you can easily access the documents referenced in the slides by clicking on the hyperlinks embedded in the slides. Although this video is not intended to be standalone, I will provide a quick overview of the Commission before addressing the main topics of this video. The objective of this video is to address a single and very important recommendation made by the Commission. Specifically, the Commission recommends that a reasonable setback distance for wireless telecommunications facilities be no less than 1,640 feet or 500 meters from locations where people live, work, go to school, and recreate. In showing where that setback number came from, I will refer to a range of studies, and I will also provide links to those studies in the slides. I'm doing this so that you can check for yourself the sources that we use to draw our conclusions. I should note that I am preparing this video in collaboration with Professor Paul Iru, who is also a member of the New Hampshire Commission. Professor Iru is an active member of the Department of Epidemiology, Biostatistics, and Occupational Health at McGill University and is an internationally recognized expert in the effects of electromagnetic fields and human health. Before I begin, I'd like to state that I have no conflict of interest in this discussion. I have not received any compensation for my work on the Commission, nor have I been compensated for any of my follow-on work, which includes giving presentations and creating videos like this one. I'm speaking to you now simply as a fellow citizen. And now for a quick overview of the New Hampshire Commission. It was convened through bipartisan legislation. It was passed by the legislature, both houses of the legislature, and signed by the governor. And what is important about this, or significant, is that this is the first legislation passed in the United States calling for the formation of a commission to explore the health effects of 5G and wireless communication. In all, we ended up with 13 commission members, backgrounds including physics, toxicology, electromagnetics, epidemiology, biostatistics. The bottom line is that we had the experts on this commission that could make the decisions and make the recommendations that we were asked to make. We met over a one-year period, and we looked at lots of papers. We brought in experts, and we have a final report linked here, and you might want to read it. It's long, but basically it's summarized in about 10 pages near the beginning. So our overarching conclusion is that wireless radiation is harmful, and it's something that we'll make recommendations. We are making recommendations, have made recommendations, suggesting ways that we could protect citizens from that radiation. So you can see more information. I've got links there to videos that describe more about the Commission and how we went about making our recommendations. So the fundamental question that I want to address in this video is what a reasonable setback distance from a cell tower transmitter should be, and why did the New Hampshire Commission pick a setback distance of 500 meters? Well, to begin with, it's important to note that there are no perfect answers to this question because of the difficulty in identifying what a safe level of exposure is. It's also recognized that what is safe for one person might not be safe for another. People who are electrosensitive can experience symptoms of radiation exposure at distances greater than 1,640 feet from a cell tower, which means that the proposed setback may not ensure a reasonable exposure level for electrosensitive people. Electrosensitivity is real, and it is recognized by the Americans with Disabilities Act and Medicare. There are also indications that the number of people with electrosensitivity is increasing, along with increasing levels of background radiation. A goal of the Commission in establishing a setback was to provide a reasonable protection for the majority of people while not impeding the use of wireless communication. When using their own wireless devices, citizens maintained control of how much radiation exposure they receive. Those wireless devices include their own cell phones, cordless phones, wireless applications such as printers and baby monitors, and people have the option of turning these devices off if they do not wish to be exposed. However, they're not able to turn off a nearby cell tower if they want to lessen their exposure. The Commission felt that by recommending a reasonable setback distance for cell towers, citizens would be able to reduce their exposure to a level where most people do not experience adverse health effects. Just as people are able to control their risks with issues such as driving, eating, drinking, etc., we believe that people should be able to control their risk with respect to radiation exposure. To determine a reasonable setback distance, we took two basic approaches. One approach is to look at the adverse health effects as a function of the distance people live from a cell tower. By tracing adverse health effects as a function of the distance people live from cell towers, we can get a pretty good sense of where exposure risk becomes reasonable. There have been at least 10 studies that have done this, and I will be referencing a few of them in the next few slides. A second way to determine a safe setback distance has two steps. The first step is to identify the lowest power density in the laboratory that is shown to produce adverse health effects. There are many studies that have done this, and so there's a reasonable consensus about what the radiation levels where adverse effects begin to occur. The second step is to identify the distance from a typical cell tower where that lowest level of radiation occurs. At that distance, most people should not experience adverse health effects, so that distance should be a reasonable setback distance to choose. Determining a setback distance using these two approaches provides us with a reasonability check. If we were to get very different answers using the two approaches, we wouldn't have much confidence in our results. Fortunately, the two approaches give very similar results, so we're confident that the setback the Commission recommended is a good one. Let's start with approach 1, which looks at the prevalence of adverse health effects for people living near cell tower transmitters, and then find out what the distance is where those significant health problems diminish. As mentioned previously, there have been at least 10 studies that have looked at the adverse effects of radiation as a function of distance that people lived from a cell tower. The one that I'll use here is from Brazil, and I'm using it because it demonstrates so clearly the relationship we're looking for. One important aspect of the Brazilian study is that it took place between 1996 and 2006. And the reason this is important is because a lot of people didn't have cell phones in Brazil at that time. In fact, by 2011, 5 years after the study ended, only 28% of that population had cell phones. So we can assume that the percentage was much lower during the time of the study. Because of this, the results provided by the study give a good indication of the effects of living near a cell tower rather than from a person's own cell phone or other radiating sources. Also of importance is that the study derived its results from a large number of towers and a large number of people. Specifically, the study looked at the deaths of over 7,000 people living near over 800 cell towers. And these numbers are sufficiently large as to give us a clear indication of the negative health outcomes for people living near those towers. As indicated by the publication's title, what this study explored was the incident of death rate from cancer, that's neoplasia, as a function of the distance people lived from a cell tower. One other result from that publication is that the highest level of radiation measured during the study, and in which it came out to be 408 milliwatts per meter squared. I'll try to put that into context here, but the notable thing about that, it's only 5% of the allowable FCC limit. So this is in a study that documented significant adverse effects from radiation exposure, yet the maximum exposure was only 5% of the limit. Now, the takeaway from the Brazilian study is shown in a single graph on the next slide. The plot you're looking at shows the death rate from cancer as a function of the distance people lived from a cell tower. The red trace is for people in the study, and the blue trace represents the death rate by cancer for the population in general. It's encouraging to note that the red and blue traces converge with increasing distance from a cell tower. If that weren't the case, the results would certainly be suspicious. Also, the monotonic decline in cancer rate with distance implies a dose-dependent relationship, which also is to be expected from a study like this. In the context of determining a reasonable setback distance, it can be seen that the cancer rate at 500 meters is still above the cancer incidence rate for the population in general. Because of this, greater setback distances were considered by the Commission, although they were not considered to be realistic. So people living at the proposed setback distance from a cell tower transmitter will experience an elevated cancer risk compared to someone living farther from the transmitter. However, this was considered to be a reasonable trade-off. The setback that we came up with, 500 meters, 1,640 feet, was considered to be a reasonable trade-off between safety and access to wireless communication. While the Brazilian study only addresses the rate of cancer, radiation exposure also causes a range of other adverse effects. As documented in some of the other videos, low-level exposure, such as the exposure you get from your own cell phone or a nearby cell tower, can result in health problems ranging from infertility to insomnia to dementia to cancer and other documented maladies. When multiple studies have been carried out on a particular phenomenon, a meta-study is often performed to combine the results from all of the studies to provide greater statistical confidence in the answers. As seen in this slide, a meta-study was performed on the 10 studies that explored the health outcomes versus distance people lived from cell towers. This meta-study included that Brazilian study that I just mentioned, and 8 of the 10 studies that were looked at by the meta-study showed a correlation between distance people lived from a cell tower and health outcomes. What is particularly relevant to this video is that 500 meters is identified as a breakpoint for exposure risks, which supports the setback distance proposed by the Commission. So now let's look at approach 2, which is to identify the exposure levels that are known to cause negative health outcomes as determined in the laboratory, and find out how far you have to get from a typical cell tower before you reach that level of radiation. Rather than take you through the large number of reports that document the harmful radiation threshold, I'll show you the results from the Bioinitiative report shown here. This report is updated yearly, and it reflects a complete compilation of scientific findings relating to radiation exposure, including the threshold where harmful effects begin. If you choose to download the report, you'll see that the exposure values referenced have a solid foundation in peer-reviewed science. Referring to the slide, it is seen that the bioeffects begin to be observed at levels of 0.03 milliwatts per square meter. To put that number in perspective, 0.03 milliwatts per meter squared is 5,000 times the signal level required for a good, that is a 3 to 4 bar phone conversation. The upper range of that exposure threshold is 5.5 milliwatts per meter squared, and it has been identified as the threshold level in some of the studies. Given the objectives of the proposed setback, namely to provide a reasonable degree of protection, the 0.5 milliwatt per square meter value was considered to be consistent with that goal. It is recognized that this level may be too high for electrosensitive people, but as noted in the beginning of this video, the setback may not protect everyone. You may be asking, why did we not recommend a particular power density value rather than proposing a setback? And the answer is that the setbacks are more clearly defined and can be applied equally to all cell towers. Determining signal level versus distance will vary considerably from tower to tower, so using signal level as a criterion for tower siting would be a complicated and expensive proposition. So having identified an exposure limit of 0.5 milliwatts per meter squared, the next step is to find how far you need to go from a typical cell tower to reach that value. For that, we needed to look at signal level versus distance for a typical cell tower. What you're looking at now is a plot of signal power density as a function of distance from a cell tower in meters. These are measured values, and details about the measurements can be accessed through the link provided. What's important is that the information presented here is for a typical tower. Referring to the plot, it is seen that the measured signal level increases with distance between 30 and 70 meters. This may seem to be counterintuitive because we generally think of power as decreasing as one gets farther from the radiator. The reason that the signal level increases from in the range between 30 and 70 meters is that the observer is entering the main beam of the directional antenna that is used on cell towers. As the observer moves farther from the antenna, the change in elevation angle with respect to the antenna becomes smaller, so that the antenna pattern no longer becomes the dominant mechanism affecting observed power density. After that point, around 70 meters in the plot, power density is seen to decrease to with near free space loss for the distances plotted. Recall that what we're looking for is the distance at which the power density drops to 0.5 milliwatts per square meter. Reading from the plot, that threshold is reached at a distance of around 500 meters. This is the same as the distance that the epidemiological studies showed a marked decline in adverse health effects. So we saw that in the first approach, and we used that to determine the setback. Using the second approach, we see that we get this same value. So this close agreement between the two approaches is a good indication that the chosen setback distance of 500 meters, 1,640 feet, is an appropriate one. The bullet points on this slide tell a story that is typical of the way telecommunications industry uses their consultants to get wireless facility permits approved. A recording of the consultant's presentation is linked, along with a link documenting industry affiliations, even though that affiliation was not acknowledged by the consultant. There is also a link to criticism of the Brazilian report written by the consultant. The consultant did not acknowledge authorship of that criticism, but only stated that the Brazilian study had been discredited. Finally, it was not noted that the authors of the Brazilian study responded to the criticisms identified by the consultants. It appears that the consultant's goal was simply to introduce doubt about a very damning report. Having addressed the issue of industry attacking reports like this, we can move forward to the conclusions. So the conclusions are significant biological effects do not appear to occur at distances greater than 500 meters from a typical cell tower. Now, significant for most people, but as pointed out earlier, if you're electrosensitive, you may experience problems at 500 meters. And so this does not protect everybody as noted. Also, that the power density at 500 meters from a typical cell tower is near the power density considered to not cause biological effects in the laboratory. So as we saw in the previous slides, those two approaches agree. The epidemiological approach, looking at the incidence of adverse effects within the 500 meters, and then the signal level at 500 meters from a typical cell tower also being around the level, the signal power density where adverse effects occur. The telecommunication industry will claim that no setback is necessary because they do not recognize the danger of wireless radiation, which is in sharp contrast to the findings of the impartial New Hampshire State Commission. And finally, implementing the setbacks will not inhibit robust cell phone coverage, although it may make cell tower siting a little bit more expensive. The setback will require the use of taller towers, which will provide more uniform coverage without exposing people to harmful radiation. And I make this statement as someone who has spent a good bit of my career measuring and modeled microwave radiation. So in summary, The recommendation of a setback by the New Hampshire Commission is justified from a scientific perspective, as it goes a long way in protecting citizens from what has been shown to be a clearly harmful toxin. So having a setback gives people more of a choice about the amount of radiation they're exposed to, and it will ease their fears about having a cell tower installed close to their homes. Providing this protection will likely make some cell tower installations more expensive, but it will not interfere with the availability of wireless communications. In fact, having more tall towers may likely increase overall connectivity. This concludes my presentation on the setback, and I thank you for watching.